Dr. Jack Kruse.
How are
Welcome to
you?
the show, man. How are you?
Pretty good.
Love to hear it. How's El Salvador?
Very nice.
Love it. You moved there because of heteroplasmy, correct? I just wanted to make that clear.
No, not really.
What was it?
For decentralization.
Talk to me about it. I know you built a house there. I know the name is Our House. It's beautiful. What are you doing in El Salvador?
Lots of different things. Setting my business up here, working with the government, trying to decentralize medicine. Those are all the things that I'm interested in doing.
Beautiful. Thank you. So I'm gonna get right into it. I want to know, what's your story? What woke you up to get you to where you are today?
I mean, that's a loaded question. Woke me up in what sense?
In being aware of the world we live in.
Again, that's not cutting the cheese for me. I mean, there's two different sides of this: the professional side, and then I guess the living as a human side. The professional side is quite a bit different than the human side.
Whatever you want to share.
I mean, the professional side started over 20 years ago when I realized that most of what I was taught in medical school was bullshit. And it was part of the reason why I needed to start doing things a little bit differently. It took me getting an injury to my knee to wake up to that. And long story short, when it occurred in Birmingham, Alabama, I woke up and I started to change everything about my professional life. Then it started to bleed into my own life.
When all this happened, Jack, when you started to study melanocortin pathway, circadian biology, was it hard for you to maybe grasp that everything that you were taught was, a lie?
No, because at the time you're curious when you start to realize that there's another pathway to disease that starts with light and it's buried in every single mammal on the planet, not just humans. You begin to go, I need to examine this more. That curiosity kind of switches the TV channel from what you learn to what you're learning now. And then once you learn the new stuff, then you begin to realize you're going to have to subtract some of the old stuff that doesn't fit what the new data says. And, it's kind of like trying to fill your cup past full. You can't do that. And so taking out some of the old superfluous stuff was actually a natural consequence of finding new things that made a lot more sense.
Love that. And what did you start to pick up when you started to study the leptin-melano-cortin pathway? And when you were studying that, what did you feel? Did you feel that maybe you had to share this to the rest of the world?
No,
No?
no, not at all. It was really more about me and about my own issues. And then it bled into other people because of another doctor who I started to talk to about. And he said, look, I'd like to send you a couple of patients. He was a gastroenterologist, wasn't even a neurosurgeon. And these were tough cases for him to deal with. He said, let's see if this works on them. So we did that. And those people started to get better. And then I started to do it on some of my patients in the clinic, and it worked on them. And then one thing led to another. And he said to me in the surgeon's lounge one day, he goes, why don't you think about putting this online for everybody to see, because this stuff will never get published, in a respectable journal, because it breaks every single paradigm belief that's out there in centralized medicine. So that's what I did.
Know that. And I know that before you were a neurosurgeon, you were a dentist. And I'm curious to know what got you interested in working on.
Well, I mean, nobody in my family had ever been to college before me. And the first doctor I interacted with was an oral surgeon who diagnosed my grandfather with oral melanoma. And that's the reason
Love that. And during, being a neurosurgeon, having done more than 10,000 operations, being a dentist, didn't you ever feel that something was maybe a little bit off in the centralized way of teaching things, and how to work on people?
Yeah, I think everybody feels that there's something off in different ways, but you don't really have time to question things when you're going through your training,
Hmm.
especially through neurosurgery training because it's so arduous.
Hmm.
Um, but you do think about different things. I think when the rubber meets the road is after you finish your training, you come out and you find out that you do everything that you're taught to do, both for your board exam and for your patients. But when you do those things multiple times over and the patient doesn't get the results, that you were led to believe in residency, um, that's when you have to start questioning things. And
Hmm.
you don't really have that opportunity as a resident because with most rotations, you're only there from 4 to 12 weeks. So there's not a lot of patient follow up. So you may do surgeries, but the time that you see the patient is really maybe for 1 or 2 post op visits. You don't see them and see how their return, to their life is, to see what their struggle is.
Hmm.
But when you finish residency and you're taking care of your own patients from day zero all the way through, that's the eye opener.
Hmm. I love that. And I know I was looking for your Instagram lives. I love how you do them, by the way. And there was a live you recorded on the beach of Tustin during COVID, where you were talking about how was, you were solo, and that you had a dream about changing the world, right? How how did this how did COVID impact your life?
Well, I mean, COVID was an impact to everybody's life, but the dream that I had is I knew about something that had happened a long time ago in New Orleans and how it was related to a polio vaccine. And I thought to myself, probably, I'm going to say 3.5, 4 years ago,
Hmm.
when all the stuff started with Eco Health Alliance and Fauci and the stuff that was going on with China and Ukraine having, level 4 bioweapons labs over there. I just thought to myself, reading some of the papers, wouldn't it be ironic if some of the stuff that happened in the 50s and 60s spilled out, into the modern way of doing technologies? And I was aware of Dr. Malone's work around RNA technology, and I just started to read some patents about the mRNA technology. And one of the things that I noticed was things hadn't changed too much since I was in med school and residency. You still needed some way to get past the nuclear membrane in order to make messenger RNA technology operate. And right now, the only way to do that, or I should say, even back then, 20, 25 years ago, is using DNA plasmids or something called the SV40 promoter.
Mm.
And the SV40 promoter we learned about because of the story in the polio vaccine that I told you I learned about a long time ago. And when it became obvious to me in about January, February of 2020 that the WHO was gonna, make a call on a pandemic and it was tied to this coronavirus.
Hmm.
And let's put it this way: I had a very open mind, but when I started to hear this stuff about the vaccine very, very early on, I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. They
Hmm.
had to be working on this even before this started. And so I started doing some digging, and that digging led, you know, to some of the science. And I realized almost immediately that I had to connect the dots between what happened in the Cutter event, what was going on in the pandemic. And I really believe that the pandemic was a planned event, by the World Economic Forum, but it had a lot of different players. This was not just one institution that could pull something like this off. And I also knew that the Department of Defense had to be involved because I knew what the chain of events was with SV40, where it came from, that the Department of Defense was involved heavily in it when it eventually went from the Delta Primate Center in New Orleans to Fort Detrick, which was our bioweapons lab before the Patriot Act was done. And it became very clear to me very early in 2020 that the transfer of molecular genetic information went from the United States to outside of our borders. And that's when I started really paying attention to a lot of the details. And in the details, the things that concerned me the most that I explained to my members at the
Mhm.
time is that there was two legal definitions that were on the books for the vaccines. And I thought that this was highly unusual. And the night that I had this dream, I thought about why they would do that. And it dawned on me that they would use one for the FDA trial, and they would use the second one for the vaccine that they would use on people. So that way they could get through some of the geoengineering information and skate past most of the centralized thinkers about this. Now, some of the molecular geneticists that were involved in this were smart enough to pick up on this. Like, for example, Robert Malone and Dr. McCullough, who's a cardiologist, they were on this pretty early, like I was. In fact, we all did a documentary called COVID Revealed that had to be behind a paywall
Mhm.
at that time. And this specific topic was the number one thing that I brought to that table. I said, look, the fact that there's two legal definitions when these vaccines become available, I think you'd be an idiot if you take it. Why? Because I think some of the things that happen in Qatar 1 event could happen in Qatar 2.0. Because if you know the way the vaccine was delivered to market, there was no safety or efficacy trials at all. I
Mhm.
said, you're basically just taking someone's word for it. And, that has a name in my brand of science. It's called centralized science or centralized bullshit.
Mhm.
And I warned my own tribe. I didn't really bring this out live on the internet. I just gave a lot of casual warnings that you probably want to use solar redox and not manufactured pharmaceutical devices in order to, navigate this problem. And, the real problem at the time, there wasn't too many physicians. And when I say physicians, I'm talking about MDs who were clinicians that understood this, or MDs who were PhDs that worked in genetics who truly understood it. In fact, most of the MDs that were involved in this were MDs that were on TV that were hired guns
Of course.
by media, and I knew that the media was controlled by the NRO, the CIA, and the FBI. We knew that all the way back to the Church Commission in 1977. And some of the people that were even named in the Church Commission were still on network news at the time. So I knew that they would basically parrot whatever the FDA, the CDC, the DOD, um, and the AMA wanted them to. In other words, this was a very coordinated attempt. It was almost like a military. I don't want to call it a psyop because it really wasn't a psyop. It was actually a military operation. And a lot of people, I don't think, 2 or 3 years ago realized that Operation Warp Speed, if you really want to strip it down, what should you know about that if you're a voter in the United States? That this was a distribution plan of the Department of Defense. This is a DARPA sponsored event. So when people think that there's some kind of vaccine liability protection to Pfizer, there is for the standard things, but for this specific issue that's going on with the virus now, or I should say the vaccine now, this is now a DNA contamination issue, and this actually is not covered by their protection. And the real issue that's going to have to be adjudicated, as far as I'm concerned, I think PI attorneys, which are, generally personal injury attorneys and attorneys that do class action suits, I think when they parse into this enough, they're going to realize that they're ultimately not going to be able to sue Pfizer for this. They're probably going to have to sue the DOD. And when you understand that suing the DOD is a losing battle. The government doesn't lose cases like this, even if they're wrong. So then you're left with only one answer, and that answer is you have to have medical freedom laws, put in somewhere in your constitution. The problem in the United States is the United States legislative branch and executive branch are captured by the industrial military complex and the industrial healthcare complex. So that makes the issue kind of difficult. And, I talked about those details in detail with Rick Rubin and Bobby Kennedy in the podcast I did with them.
Mhm.
And I think most people heard that podcast. It was done in October of 23. Um, they heard Bobby's response, what he had planned to do. I can tell you, I think Bobby's plan has changed since that podcast because I don't think Bobby knew at the time he did the podcast of some of the stuff, that I'm talking to you about today, that it's now a DNA plasma problem, it's an SV40 problem. And if you understand truly where we are in mid December, early January of 2023, 24, um, the real place to strike is in another country that doesn't have this issue with the DoD. In fact, they just have documents that link them to big pharma.
Mhm.
That means that the legal grounds outside the United States is ripe for actually taking these people down and bringing them to the knees. The problem is it requires you to have a pretty strong stomach if you're, a leader in another country. And I think the aftermarket data that's been coming out for the last 6, 7 months, it's pretty clear now that myocarditis is a huge issue. Uh, Now everybody knows about the DNA plasmid issue and the SV40 thing because of Kevin McKiernan and Philip Buchholz's work. But the next big issue that's going to hit, probably, I think, in the next couple of weeks, is something that Philip Buchholz brought up in his testimony, that's been plastered all over the internet, where if you look at the technology, it was pretty obvious from a molecular geneticist standpoint that frame shift mutations would occur. And this would begin to explain some of the aftermarket data that a guy on the internet who's a former naval intelligence officer picked up on. The Europeans called it turbo cancer, but in the United States, we started to notice that there was a lot of soft tissue cancers
Mhm.
causing death in people, that had no history of cancer. And then there was people who had cancers that were in remission that they got virulent forms of it. And then there were other people uh, who got cancer in what we would call a de novo pathway. And the interesting thing about all this is that spike at higher latitudes has been bigger than it has been at lower latitudes. Like where I am now, 13th latitude, most of the data still in complications hovers around autoimmunity and heart problems.
Mhm.
But if you get above probably about the 23rd, 24th latitude, and you look at all the data that's out there, for example, the data that right now is being parsed out on the internet between some of the scientists that are interested in this is the New Zealand data and the European data. It clearly shows that something awry is going on, and when something awry goes on with a new medication that has not gone through proper safety and efficacy, was made available to the public through emergency use authorizations, that means that the regulatory bodies in those countries have a duty to stop it. That has not happened in the United States. It has not happened anywhere in North America. It hasn't happened in Central America or South America, but it's beginning to happen in places like Asia, Australia. I mean, one of the big inquiries that's going on right now as we speak is the inquiries in the UK. And Boris Johnson just gave testimony this week, and anybody who listens to that testimony knows that he's completely full of shit. His WhatsApp texts clearly show that the government and likely their industrial military complex were also involved in this. And
Mhm.
you remember the legal standards in each country are different. That's what makes this really difficult. And probably the most prominent attorney that's been most vocal in the States about this has been a guy named Thomas Renz, Renz. He has a lot of data that I think he's looking to turn into a class action lawsuit.
Mhm.
I actually think that the two pathways that are open legally are probably going to be a class action suit, but also I have a funny feeling that the RICO statute may come into play somewhere down the road. I'm not a lawyer and I don't intend to play one on, social media,
Mhm.
podcast, but I've talked to enough lawyers that I think that when the co-conspirators are outed through this data, then I think you're going to have a very, very interesting situation develop. And the irony was, I mentioned this to Bobby Kennedy off screen. Most people don't know this, but Bobby Kennedy's dad invented the RICO statute. That's one of the people that got killed, by our own government.
Mhm.
So to me, I almost look at it like karma. It's boomeranging back around on everybody, because I don't think they thought this through. And I think when you basically blow through informed consent and you begin to censor people, because I mean, that's effectively what this was. This was censorship of science, and we're supposed to have free speech in this country. And the problem is the media no longer protects people from the government. That's the whole purpose of the First Amendment.
Mhm.
When the government, and it's shown that the industrial military complex has tried to use a military operation to censor guys like me, McCullough, Malone, Kevin McKiernan. Dude, that's where there's a problem. And the thing that's come out, there's another gentleman that's been pretty prominent, on the Twitter front. He's also a former doctor. I don't think he practices anymore. His name's Schellenberger. He just went and testified, up at Congress, and he actually outed one of the people during her testimony when she said that I never said this was conspiracy theory. Literally, in her opening statement, she said it to the committee that they were both speaking to, and people took the video recordings and said, "Do you understand that this has gotten so serious that the people that were involved in this now are being caught in their own flypaper?" The same thing just happened to Boris Johnson. And,
Mhm.
Philip Buckholz, even though I don't like to give him too much credit because he was an asshole through this whole thing, as far as I'm concerned, because he's a centralized scientist that makes a lot of money in grants from oncology. So he is incentivized not to really buy this whole story. But it was Kevin McKiernan that brought this story out when he found that this contamination was in fact present. All Buckholz did was reconfirm it. It's now been confirmed by multiple labs, so it's no longer conspiracy theory. It's actually fact.
Mhm.
And where we are now is one of the things that Buckholz said in an interview that he did with Marianne Damasi of Australia. He said, if it's shown that point mutations can occur because of this endeavor, then there's a huge problem. Well, guess what, Philip? That information is also now available, just broke in the last week to 10 days. So the story continues. The story continues to evolve.
Mhm.
And I don't know if there's enough people out there that aren't apathetic, that aren't nihilistic. Like your age group, I think, is pretty nihilistic. I think the rest of America is pretty apathetic. And I don't even know if knowing the science and knowing what your government did is enough to piss people off. I think the one thing that is going to really piss people off when they begin to understand that why they wanted to make them sick is to create cancer cases so they could rehypothecate that money to run their wars. That I think is a different take on things. Why? Because you saw how pissed off pretty much the left, right, and center in the United States was when we ended the Afghanistan war. And that war didn't end because of Biden, it ended because of Trump. And Biden had to do something with it. And when he did, he just left everything in Afghanistan after 20 years and us spending trillions of dollars, that's what you call a horrible waste of money. And if you know anything about the industrial military complex, they are the biggest waste generators in the world. War is a really expensive game, but we got the idea in World War II because of General Groves that it was a good business for our economy. The problem is, in one sense, General Groves was correct. It did help us in the 50s to rebuild, Europe and the United States, but that's when money actually wasn't terribly rehypothecated. It wasn't, in bad shape. It was still backed by gold.
Mhm.
Uh, that's no longer the case. And
Mhm.
that ceased to be the case in 1971 when Nixon basically closed the gold window for the reasons that, you can see in his speech. But the real reason was he had to pay for the Vietnam War. That was actually the reason they did it. And now the jig is up because we're at the end of the debt, cycle, just like we were in the Great Depression. Money is now being devalued so much that they're going to have to print huge amounts of money and try to rehypothecate it. So, what's been the goal of the two captured branches of government, meaning the executive and legislative branch? They have been trying to do everything possible to get us to a CBDC. Why? Because the CBDC is a digital form of money that they can rehypothecate so they can continue to run their forever wars. And this is why, after the Patriot Act came to be from 9/11, we magically started to see HHS become another federal bureaucracy. What does HHS do? It covers healthcare in the United States. So
Yeah.
that means that the DoD, the Pentagon, the Treasury, literally is operating on the same plane in the executive branch, which is already captured. So you can see the tentacles now can get to the money. Why? Because what's the most potent driver of our economy? If you go to any of the top 50 cities in the United States, you'll find out the number one employer and profit center is a cancer institute.
Mm.
So therein lies the link. So if I would have told you all this 3 years ago, you would have definitely called me a conspiracy theorist, and you probably would have been correct because, as I said to Bobby Kennedy, what's the difference between fact and fiction? Fiction has to make sense for people to believe it, but the truth doesn't. And see, that's the reason why the CIA got this idea through MK Ultra is if you keep key parts of the story away from people, they can get deniable plausibility by saying, this is just conspiracy theory. This is too far out and wackadoodle stuff until you get to a point where you're able to put it all together and it begins to make sense.
Mhm.
And when you see all the parts, unfortunately, what I think the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the industrial, military, and healthcare complex screwed up on, their plan being run by Fauci, Collins, the FDA, the CDC, the World Health Organization, and the WEF, it wasn't well planned at all, and there wasn't a lot of coordination in the plan, and that's why the House of Cards is now beginning to fall apart. The key real issue right now is how do people put the cards back together and understand it. I was in a Twitter Spaces yesterday where I heard an African American gentleman basically tell Steve Kirsch, who is one of the guys that has the New Zealand data, that's right now a hot potato, basically tell him there's no way that, people could be dying and getting cancer and having myocarditis from these because him and his 20 friends were fine. That's the level of poor thinking
Yeah.
that's out there. And that's why I say to you, when your world is filled with a bunch of dumbasses, it goes right to Anne Ryan's book where she said the dumbasses one day will be the majority, and because they're the majority, that will give them the industrial military complex and the government, irrespective of whether they're communist, socialist, fascist, unbelievable power. Why? Because it goes back to Roman times. Just give them carnival and gladiator games, which today we have in Netflix and social media,
Yeah.
and nobody will give two fucks about the truth. And I'm betting from afar
Mhm.
that might change. I'm betting in El Salvador that this small little country
Mhm.
who has decentralized their money, they've already seen the wisdom in freeing up freedom in your money,
Hmm.
maybe they'll wise up about freeing up freedom in medicine too.
Yeah, I was about to say I think I have to move to El Salvador because it's getting.
Well, let's put it this way: President Bukele is building an ark here, but he doesn't want everybody down here. I can tell you that. He only wants the right animals.
Hmm.
And who are the right animals? It's not that guy that was in the Twitter spaces saying, everything is fine. My friends didn't die from the vaccine. Therefore, hitherto, let me watch my Netflix and go to basketball games and I'll be good. It's going to be the Steve Kirsches, the Kevin McKiernans, the Jack Kruses, the Robert Malones, those people who actually care about the truth, care
Hmm.
about getting the story right, telling people, okay, now that this shit's happened, what do you do so that you don't get these problems, and be able to do it on large enough channels so that everybody hears the message, even if they don't have money to go see a doctor. Um, and right now, since the media is captured, that's a really difficult task to do.
Hmm. I first listened to your work through Rubin's podcast with Andrew Huberman, and I've been really curious on the hack you did to Rick Rubin. How did you help him um, kind of go through this process after his heart surgery?
Well, it wasn't how I helped them. I mean, I did help him, but I think it's the bigger interesting part of Rick is know that Rick is not a scientist. He actually said that multiple times on the podcast. He actually doesn't care to learn quantum mechanics, but what he does is he has a stable of healthcare practitioners that cover all aspects of medicine. Allopathic medicine, decentralized medicine, functional medicine, even shamanism. Um, some of this far out stuff. Why? Because Rick is one of those cats that has an open mind. He
Hmm.
he wants to know everything that he can know. So when he talked to everybody about the issue that he's having, that he needed to have urgent surgery because of his problem, I was the last person he talked to. Okay. And he said, Jack, I got to have this surgery. It's not a matter of putting it off. He goes, give me your best hack
Hmm.
in terms of, what you would do if you were in my shoes. And I said, okay, I got it. And we did about I don't know, it was probably 45-minute to an hour consult over the phone. I
Hmm.
told him exactly what I would do. I warned him that the people that he was going to talk to about this weren't going to like it. And I was right. Pete Adia said I was an idiot. And,
Yeah.
his surgeon was like, look, I'm not going to change my template, because this is something you want, because I'm the world expert in this type of surgery. I do it my way. And that's the reason why I have the results I have. And I told Rick, I respect the surgeon for saying that because I actually agree with what the surgeon said. The problem is, Rick didn't need the compliance of the surgeon. Remember, the surgeon only does the surgery.
Yeah.
Uh, the maximum benefit for Rick would have been methylene blue while he was on heart bypass in the machine. But Rick decided to take the bull by the horns and said, as soon as my surgery's over, I'm going to start this on my own because nobody can tell me fucking anything.
Hmm.
And I was like, that's the essence of decentralization. Not only should the doctors be decentralized, but guess who else has to be decentralized? This is the part of decentralized medicine everybody forgets
The
is the
patient.
patient.
Yeah.
Because guess what? If the patient doesn't listen to the doctor, that could be a benefit in the centralized healthcare system. In a decentralized healthcare system, if the patient doesn't listen to the advice, that's actually a reason to cut them from the system.
Hmm.
In other words, you have to realize this sword cuts both ways.
Hmm.
It's a meritocracy. And if you're not willing to do the things that needs to happen, then you can't hold the doctors liable for your non-compliance. In other words, you have to take ownership of that. And I have to tell you, a lot of centralized doctors like this part of decentralized medicine. Why? Because it's completely absent in centralized medicine.
Mm.
Um, Now, I will tell you that the powers that be at Harvard University have tried for a long time to decrease our pay when patients have complications.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm happy to report that that's never happened, but that hasn't stopped the communist fucks that run these places that are trying to screw, how we practice medicine. And that's part of the reason why doctors are, in the centralized perspective, are so burned out now. They are being destroyed by the system. The system is not just destroying the patients, it's actually destroying the doctors.
Mhm.
That's the reason why doctors are killing themselves at record rates. It's the reason why they're burning out. It's also the reason why they're professionally dissatisfied. And you remember, to continue to practice, their job, most of them were forced to take a vaccine that they had no choice in taking.
Mhm.
And now some of them are really pissed off about it.
Of course.
And we've already had some legal cases, like in the state of New York, where people who were fired that didn't do it now are getting their back pay. I think the more interesting lawsuits that haven't happened yet, because of some of the things we talked about earlier in this podcast, what happens when it's found out that the government forced people to do something that actually harms them? Far worse than coronavirus, because let's face it, coronavirus is like just having the flu for most people. And when you think about young, fit athletes dropping dead from heart attacks, we saw that on live TV with Damar Hamlin. He still hasn't recovered enough to be a starter for the Buffalo Bills. Probably never will again.
Mhm.
I wonder also about a lot of the injuries since the NFL mandated the COVID vaccine. I still remember the day that Anthony Brown walked off the field when he played for I think it was the Jets. Oh no, Tampa Bay, and said I'm done, and everybody thought he was crazy
Mhm.
because he faked his vaccine card
Mhm.
in the NFL. And I think about all the players that likely have had injuries since that time. Like I think about guys like Darius Leonard. Is the reason he's not got back to his tip-top shape tied to what happened to him? I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to those things, but I will tell you, based on the data that we now know that's out there, those questions should be asked, and it should be okay to ask them when you're a doctor in this paradigm. Why? Because we now know that these vaccines that were mandated and forced on
Mhm.
people were clearly a problem.
Yeah. Why would administrating methylene blue during Rick's surgery been the maximum benefit? I'm very curious about that.
I wouldn't say that it would be the maximum benefit. What it allows you to do
Mhm.
is optimize thermodynamics while your blood is being put into a mechanical machine to keep you alive, because they had to stop your heart to do the
Okay.
things they did. That's the whole point. And it's a huge bridge. It's a bridge that cardiovascular surgeons use in cardiovascular surgery, and neurosurgeons use when there's mitochondrial damage in the brain and the brain swells and we can't put the skull back on.
Mhm.
We're probably the two branches of centralized medicine that understand how it's used. And to be honest with you, I don't really talk about how medicine is practiced on podcasts, because to be honest with you, it can get you into trouble.
Mm.
Uh, but methylene blue has been out a really, really long time. We're
Yeah.
talking over 100 years. And most people, I think, were pretty shocked. I know Rick was shocked when I told him that some of the drugs like were used for COVID, like hydroxychloroquine. Do you know that hydroxychloroquine is a derivative of methylene blue?
Yeah.
So don't you find it interesting that a drug that has some of the similar effects actually has helped people,
Mhm.
and why everybody vehemently went against it? Well, I told everybody, at least my members, that if you have another drug that shows efficacy against coronavirus, that it inactivates the emergency use authorization claim, and that means that the vaccine becomes illegal. That is the reason why the industrial healthcare and military complex forced this on people and said, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, melatonin, vitamin D, vitamin C, all these things didn't work, because if any of them showed a benefit at all, you could not have a legal emergency use authorization. And that meant that big pharma and the FDA would have to have formal safety and efficacy trials, which they forego. That's what Operation Warp Speed was all about. The only person that could have stopped Operation Warp Speed was Trump, but Trump is not a doctor. He's not a scientist.
Mhm.
He was relying on Fauci, and Fauci was the architect of the demise.
Yeah.
He's not going to call bullshit on himself.
Yeah.
He was actually paid a 67% raise to carry out the duties of the industrial military complex. I mean, Bobby Kennedy laid that out in his book really well. You know, when the Patriot Act was enacted, he got a 67% raise to actually move the bioweapons labs to Ukraine and China. That's how it was called the China flu.
Mhm.
Uh, and most people didn't know, that chain of events from the primate center in Covington, which is a bioweapons 4 lab in the United States, to Fort Detrick, then Fort Detrick to these international places. And this is also the reason why the Chinese and the Russian government said, look, the United States' hands are dirty in this. People forget that stuff was said 2 years ago, but now you know why they said it, because it was true.
Yeah.
And the architects who came up with this plan, let's just say they didn't hide their tracks as well as the CIA did when they murdered JFK. That's the problem here. In other words, they got caught.
Mhm.
They got caught in a big way
Yeah.
because this plan really took a lot of coordination of the co-conspirators. And those co-conspirators, every single one of them need to be brought to justice.
What's your story with methylene blue? Why do you think more people should spend time looking into this, like decentralized medicine?
Um, Look, I think methylene blue is something that needs to be discussed with you and your doctor. That's it.
Mhm.
It's not something that I'm going to talk about on a podcast.
Okay. Well, I want to talk about a story where you fell asleep in a cold plunge and you lost 5 pounds.
Yeah,
Uh,
that was a long time ago.
yeah, can you talk to me about that experience and what you took away from it?
That cold thermogenesis protocol really works that I came up with close to 20 years ago.
Hmm.
I packed myself in 160 pounds of ice. I had only planned to be in there for a couple of hours.
Hmm.
And it turned out I fell asleep in the tub and woke up the next day in water that was actually not cold anymore.
Hmm.
And I jumped on the scale and I wound up losing 5 pounds that night. I also slept close to 10 hours, which also stunned
Wow,
me.
that's incredible.
CT works. Now, CT again isn't for everybody. Generally helps most mammals, but I did a Instagram live this morning
Hmm.
where I told people that if you've got a vaccine injury or you got a disease like um, fibromyalgia, or what they call ME for myalgia encephalitica, you have to be careful with the use of grounding and cold thermogenesis before you do it. You really need to build your solar redox up because those diseases are associated with diminishment of melanin, in your interior stores. So you have to reestablish a base minimum before you use that. Now, we're lucky that there's not a lot of diseases out there that cause this problem, but it turns out long COVID is one of them. ME is another one. There's others. A lot of the autoimmune conditions, especially like psoriasis, ALS, um, type 1, type 2 diabetes. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. Kawasaki's disease is another one.
Hmm.
Moya Moya. I even think really bad PAD, which is peripheral artery disease. You need to be careful with that. But those are some of the ideas, and those are the things that need to get teased out and tested when we have a decentralized nation that decides to put decentralized medicine ideas against allopathic medicine, against you know every other type of medicine that's out there, and then we get to find out truly what the return on equity is of the ideas buried in nature versus the ideas buried in big pharma's labs.
Hmm. Yeah, so talking about nature, I want to know a little bit more about human photosynthesis. This to me is new. It's incredible that our
But
well,
when you say it's new, I'm hoping that you mean that new to your perception
To me,
because
yes.
it's 600 million years old. I just
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
make
of
sure
course.
you're clear of that.
Yeah, no, it's very new to me, and it's incredibly surprising that we are so capable of just living with the sun.
Yeah, well, I'm going to tell you, I don't think it's incredibly shocking when you think about it. The entire food web on this planet is controlled by, I mean, take a look behind me. Look at all those plants. You can see the Pacific Ocean back there.
Mm,
Those plants are all driven by photosynthesis from that right there, the sun that's above me. Um, I would just tell you, it makes total sense that there would have to be another chemical in us. The one other chemical in us that actually works photosynthetically is actually hemoglobin. Another one is cholesterol. That's how you make vitamin D. So again, when you know and centralized systems know about these chemicals, why is it a shock that melanin is the key story? And what's the main difference between melanin and chlorophyll that's in leaves? If you study chlorophyll close enough,
mhm,
chlorophyll actually the first step in photosynthesis is charge separation in water to positive and negative charges, and there's a liberation of two electrons. Melanin does the exact same thing, but melanin liberates four electrons. So if you know anything about the guy that won the Nobel Prize named Einstein for the photoelectric effect, do you think you can bury more light on four electrons or two electrons?
4.
So does it make sense that complex life would use a lot more melanin than, say, the trees around us?
Mhm,
The answer is yes.
yeah,
And then when you think that most of the melanin in mammalian cells is located really close to the outer mitochondrial membrane of mitochondria, and
mhm,
you remember that all mitochondria are what? Hydrogen heat engines. They basically use protons to spin the ATPase to make ATP. Then it makes sense why H plus would be made in record amounts next to melanin and why melanin is located there. Then when you think about, well, where's melanin located in most mammals? Turns out it's really prominent on the surfaces where the what is? The sun. And then when you look at where melanin comes from, this is probably the most interesting unknown fact until I probably did the podcast with Huberman,
mhm,
is that POMC, which is a gene that's in every mammal. Remember, mammals have been on this planet for 300 million years. Melanin is made by a gene called POMC. POMC makes this big, huge gene product that gets split into six different things. One
mhm,
of those things is alpha MSH. Alpha MSH is what creates melanin. But do you know what stimulates the POMC gene to go through translation? UV light. So do a hard stop for a minute. Have you heard any dermatologist or ophthalmologist in the last 50 or 70 years advocate UV light? No. In fact, they've done exactly the opposite, but yet every mammal on this planet has a gene that gets turned on by UV light.
mhm,
Okay, now let's do another hard stop. We know it's on the exterior. You can see it in you, you can see it in me. I'm out here now. Don't mammals have melanin inside them?
yes,
Isn't that a disease called Parkinson's disease? The substantia nigra. Nigra means dark.
mhm,
Why? Because this thing is black in the middle of your brain. So you got to ask yourself, if you have melanin inside of you, it means two things. Either the sun penetrates all the way down into those spots, or might we make our own light? And it turns out both of those things are true.
mhm,
Now, they're not well known in centralized medicine, but they're extremely well known in decentralized biophysics journals. And
mhm,
it's been known since about 1923, which is why I told Huberman the first paper he should read before he does anything is the onion root experiment of Alexander Gurwitch. And then eventually, where that'll crash at the end is in the work of Fritz Popp, who showed that every living thing emits biophotons. And it turns out, if you read Roland Van Wyck's book, he has scientists from all over the world that have been studying this. They have found that biophotons seem to come from mitochondrial metabolism. So now, when you open up a book and you remember who were the architects of biochemistry, you'll find out another guy was given a Nobel Prize in 1937. His name's Albert St. Georgi. And he got a Nobel Prize for the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle, even though his science was wrong. One of the things that he said that earned him the Nobel Prize, in my view, is that he told medical students from 37 to 41 that if you look at the products of DNA, which are proteins, proteins all look like they have an electronic structure. Therefore, at the core, life should be a semiconductor.
Mm-hmm.
Hard stop. What do we now know in 2023? We know that water is a semiconductor. Hard stop. What else do we know? Melanin is a semiconductor.
Yeah.
So is chlorophyll. So is hemoglobin. So is bone. It's now been proven. But guess what? You won't find that in your biochemistry book. Because guess what? If you knew that, you might start to say, well, why am I taking drugs and I'm not using light to try to fix my problems? Well, it's pretty simple. The reason why, because you can't patent light.
Exactly.
There's your answer.
I love that. There's this quote that you shared. I don't know if it was in a talk you gave or in a Patreon post, but all cause mortality is made light. Is this because of melatonin suppression?
Well, it's due to a lot of things. I would tell you it's due to all the systems in the body because they're all working in unison in decentralized fashion. But where that quote came from, that is a compilation of a paper that was written in 2016 from Sweden, where they did a meta-analysis that showed that a lack of sun is worse than smoking cigarettes for your health. Hard stop. Think about what the study has done. Sweden, high latitude. And yet the effect still showed up in their meta-analysis. And part of the reason why this is important for centralized scientists to realize is that Sweden, for literally 130 years, has the best records, medical records, in all of the world, especially in Europe. So we can go back and look at their data pretty well, and you'll notice that melanoma and skin cancers didn't cease to be a real big problem until we started using sunblock and sunglasses in the 40s. And then things started to spike. And why is that important? What did I tell you is the main stimulant to POMC? UV light.
Oh, yeah, correct.
UV light. So when you start blocking UV light, can you make melanin?
No.
The answer is no. And guess what? The architects that were building big pharma back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they actually knew this. That's the reason why this idea came in. And they started looking for reasons to bury sunlight as a source of treatment. Most people, before I started talking about it, they didn't even know that Finson won a Nobel Prize at the turn of the century for the treatment of UV light and pemphigus vulgaris and tuberculosis. But it's true. The problem is, nobody goes back and looks at the old data. Nobody goes back and read. Nobody thinks. The sine qua non of centralized healthcare is it's recipe medicine. We don't want you to think. Just do what the fuck we tell you to do. That's it. And that's kind of what you saw during COVID too. Just sit back, watch your Netflix, get your government checks, but roll your sleeve up.
Yeah. You talk a lot about grounding. It's huge. A lot of people call me crazy for telling them to go ground. But it makes sense evolutionarily. So why do you think this topic is so overlooked?
All right, let's talk about this. So you see that we're on my roof, right?
Yes.
Take a look at what's below me. Do you see something?
Grass.
Yeah, I'm on the roof grounding. Can you imagine that? And I'm in UV light on December 10th. It's 97 degrees here, no humidity. You can see the wind blowing in the trees. It doesn't feel hot up here at all. But I got no shoes on, and I'm on my roof grounding. In fact, this is the first podcast that I've done from the roof of the new place in El Salvador. This is where I plan to do most of my podcasts. Grounding is huge. Why is it a big deal for humans versus, say, other mammals? We are the silly talking monkey in the primate group. that has altered eccrine glands and apocrine glands on our body so that they're present in our hands and our feet. So you probably know about that other crazy saying that I talk about, that I want you to make like the Sphinx every morning, look to the east and ground with all four extremities. When you make sweat here, provides a better connection to the earth. So what's the physics of grounding? Very simple. The sun is a cathode ray. The solar wind hits the planets act as anodes. Anytime a cathode ray hits an anode, what does it make on the surface? Free electrons. You have a bigger connection with the anode, you absorb more of those electrons. What did we just say 15 minutes ago about chlorophyll and melanin? One makes 2 electrons, the other one makes 4. If you have 4, you can be more complex. Do you think you can run this Ferrari engine in your head if you had sweat glands on your hands and feet better than, say, chimps or monkeys? Does it make sense now why they don't have frontal lobes?
Yeah.
And we do. See, nature provided us an accessory. And what else? We lost our hair compared to our nearest relatives. Why did we do that? Because it allowed melanin to be in our skins to do what? To act as a solar panel. And the proof that the neuroectoderm is still yoked in our bodies to the sun is this is the reason why vitamin D and vitamin A toxicity are linked together. One protects you from the other. Vitamin A is predominantly made in all the neuropsin and all the opsin systems in the body, in the brain. It's really important for neural migration. It's really important for immunity. And vitamin D is also linked to that. Remember, the vitamin D is made in your skin, then has to go through some dark reactions that present in your kidney and liver to become active. That sounds awfully similar to what's going on in photosynthesis. That's part of the reason why, when you said earlier, Jack, I just find this amazing, I don't find it amazing at all. If you know that vitamin D can do this, why wouldn't you assume that we've got some other pretty cool things in us that can do the same thing? And it turns out that grounding for primates that can talk, that have Ferrari engines, is really important. It's not that important to gorillas and monkeys. You know why? Because what are they always hugging?
Trees.
There you go. Because they live in the canopy. We don't do that, do we? We live on the tectonic surface. So guess what? We're a little bit different kind of creature. And when you put all these disparate pieces together, all of a sudden they sound less like conspiracy theory. So your dumbass friends are dumbass. And you know what that means? That means you told them the truth, and don't have the discussion again, because it makes no sense for you to give them 100% when they only give you 10%. And I'm just going to tell you that not everybody in a decentralized system is designed to get a trophy. That's the reason we have extinction events. If your friends want to be so damn cocky, like that guy that was in the room that I told you about, that none of his friends died from the vaccine, so therefore, hitherto, moreover, nobody else would be dying either. Those are the people that should get Darwin Awards. Okay? Nature has a plan for them. So when my profession tells me, the white guy that's got Fitzpatrick types 1 skin, that I shouldn't go into equatorial sun during solar noon on top of your roof without any protection, I'm not listening. Not only that, my nurse is right over there, just about completely naked on the roof, doing the same thing.
Yeah, we're made to do it. What are the dangers of staying insulated most, if not our entire lives? Because that's how people
specialize. The number one thing, it means that you're going to wind up having probably disrupted systems in your body. Like, for example, the disrupted system that was present in my body was obesity. So if you don't have enough electrons in the leptin receptor, it can lead to that problem. But let's talk about like some of the diseases that are going on today that are in the current news. Let's talk about long COVID. What happens when you don't get enough electrons in your T regulator cells or your B cells? Do you think that your immune system can work properly?
No.
How about we think about that in any other immune system? Let's talk about atopy or atopic dermatitis or acne. Let's talk about autoimmune conditions. Is this the reason fundamentally why people tend to get MS who live at high latitudes? Because they have a variable lack of electrons in their life? The answer is yes. Do I believe ALS is the same kind of condition? Yes, I believe that. I didn't believe that 20 years ago. In fact, I didn't even believe it 10 years ago, but I believe it now based on some of the new stuff that I've read. Do I think I can explain why now type 1 diabetes is exploding at really high latitudes like in Finland? Yeah. Do I can I also explain why type 2 diabetes, which was previously not remarkable for 5,000 years in India, now is, even though they're at a good latitude? Yeah, because all the Indians now that ate a vegetarian diet are now inside working for Facebook and Google, working the server farms. That didn't happen until 25, 30 years ago. So now we have the largest collection of type 2 diabetics on the planet in India, and they're very different than United States diabetics. Why? They're skinny. The ones in the United States are fat because there's two systems being involved in the United States versus one over there. Probably has a lot to do with the latitude and the amount of electrons. Also, probably has a lot to do with the fact that Indians have more melanin than Northern Europeans. Oh, we're back to that melanin story and 4 electrons versus 2. It's amazing how all this stuff fits, don't you think?
Well, not anymore. It's incredible.
Well, I mean, nature is incredible. I mean, that's part of the reason why I want people to study it. I want people to understand that you have a doctor inside you. The problem is you need to start listening to it.
Mm-hmm.
The owner's manual is contained. The ancient people knew what they were talking about. They
Of course.
couldn't explain it, but they knew.
There's this story that you talk about with Rick and Rubin in the second episode of a lady craving McDonald's French fries after her heart transplant. It's a story that blew my mind. But how does that work?
Quantum entanglement and probably proton and electron tunneling. So you have to understand a little bit of science behind this. There was a pretty controversial paper that was written by Luc Montagnier in 2009. And, he just died about a year ago. And in the paper, he basically took water with DNA in it, removed all the DNA, left the water there, then put photomultipliers on the water, sent the signal across the internet, and then sent it, I believe, to Italy from France.
Yeah.
The water then was imprinted with the electromagnetic information from the DNA that was removed. They put fragments of DNA in the new water, and magically, the exact same DNA showed up that was present in the original um, sample. So, of course, when he published this, people went batshit crazy. And, the sad part is the crazies, the homeopathists, want to say this is the basis of homeopathy. I don't think that that's actually the case. I think the thing that was much more interesting is that it actually tells you that DNA is an electromagnetic antenna and actually water is an electromagnetic capacitor. That's what it really tells you. And it tells you about information transfer. It also tells you about Landauer's principle that was, spit out in 61. Begins to make sense of the famous physicist work, John Wheeler. It also makes sense of Claude Shannon's work. Now, I just throw a lot of science at you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that means you'll have to know that science to understand how this story comes together. I probably will have a blog out on that whole story very soon, probably the next blog. Why? Because that's why I'm telling you about it. Um, the interesting part of that story is with the kid, the way it works as a neurosurgeon, we're the ones that take care of most people that get in bad accidents and have brain injuries. The kid was brain dead. I talked to the family about organ donation because he was an optimal organ donor. They decided to donate. The way it works is then the organs are harvested about 6 months later. We get a note since we were the person involved, and they tell us kind of where all the organs go. They don't give you the names of the people. They just tell you, like, the heart went here, and they give you a little spiel about that person. They do the same thing with every tissue that's donated. So it's kind of a nice thing to see that this kid's demise helped a lot of people. So about a year after the whole event happened, this lady walked into my office and talked to actually my nurse and started telling her some kind of wackadoodle story that, you just heard, that she was an ultra marathoner. She's never eaten McDonald's French fries in her life. She actually doesn't know what they taste like, but she feels like since she got her heart transplant, she does.
Mhm.
And of course, the nurses took her name down because she didn't come to see me for a neurosurgical issue. She just did her own detective homework and found out that I was somehow involved with the kid whose heart was beating in her chest.
Mhm.
So the nurses realized immediately who she was, and they said, "Look, you need to hear this story and you need to talk to her." So I brought her back. I talked to her, and I found it hard to believe. Now, this was early in my medical career, but it's happened at least two or three other times to me since that time in my 30-year history of neurosurgery. And I told somebody on a podcast not that long ago the flip side of this story just happened to me for the first time, where someone got uh, in a bad wreck and they were an organ donor, but I felt based on the patient's history that they would not be an optimal organ donor. And I was concerned that the people that got the organs might have a problem. And I didn't push the organ donation card. And I actually even talked to the surgery team about that. And I don't believe that the patient's organs were harvested, even though the organ procurement agency tried like hell to get it done. Um, and I think that was good. And the basis of this is actually Montagnier's paper. Do I believe that the process of quantum entanglement happens through electron and proton tunneling and the transfer of light information? The answer is yes. Anytime information is transferred, it goes directly to Claude Shannon's equation that he came up in information theory. And if anybody knows anybody about Claude Shannon, he was a master engineer who worked for Bell Labs in the 40s, and he wrote a paper about the mathematical basis of information transfer. And his job back then was to figure out how to make sense of all the wires in Bell Telephone to try to shrink them because they were crazy. And he felt that there was too many wires for the messages that were being transmitted. So anyway, he came up with this interesting mathematical equation. When I first read his paper a long time ago, this is before I was wised up to the decentralized story,
Mhm.
I noticed that the equation looked exactly like the second law of thermodynamics. It's called the Boltzmann equation, or the equation for entropy. And I thought to myself, isn't this interesting? That entropy thermodynamically is somehow related to information transfer. So because I found that interesting, I jumped down a new rabbit hole. This is probably when I was in med school.
Mhm.
And the rabbit hole I found out was a physicist named John Wheeler. And John Wheeler actually had the distinction of teaching Richard Feynman. He was a pretty amazing guy. He had huge effects on a lot of different aspects of science, especially in physics. But basically, he had three parts of his life. The first part was everything is about particles because that's how he learned physics first. Then everything was about electromagnetic fields because then he learned about fields because of Feynman. And then the last thing was everything is about information because he began to understand what Claude Shannon was functionally saying
Mhm.
in his paper. And what Wheeler came up with was he thought that anytime information was transferred, like it was between this kid and the lady, that heat had to be liberated. Now, the amount of heat liberated was ridiculously small number. I think it's like 0.0018 joules per centimeter squared to like the 21st power. It's like fucking ridiculous how much is in there. But then when I read that, I started to think to myself, water is an electromagnetic capacitor for heat. So we would never see the heat transfer from light. And I thought about how these things linked. And then I realized a couple of other things. I realized that when at the time of death, you know how you hear from the shaman that light is liberated I fact checked that and found out from Fritz Popwork that in fact it is true that the aura that some people can see, or
Hmm.
when you die or when you're born, there is light emission that occurs. So that light emission is information that's transferred to water. The information always has heat associated with it. Whose idea was that? It wasn't Wheeler's, it wasn't Shannon. It was this guy named Rudolf Landauer. And Landauer was a computer specialist who worked for IBM. So you can see that Shannon and Landauer were tied together. And this is the reason why Wheeler was interesting. He made sense out of the two IT guys thing that anytime information is transferred to another medium, another
Hmm.
part of matter, that heat had to be liberated. What did that functionally do? It brought physics and biology straight to E equals MC squared. In other words, what Einstein said, energy and mass are exactly the same thing. What Wheeler was saying is that energy is information. So information is also mass. So
Okay.
it meant that the light transfer actually, this mechanism that Montagnier found is physically possible with the science that we know. So I just gave you the entire ball of wax
Yes.
of how this all fits together. And like I said, if you didn't know each one of these pieces in part, I guarantee your friends that didn't understand grounding certainly would never understand this, because this is several orders of complexity compared to the grounding story. The grounding story is easy to understand because it's simple physics.
Hmm.
This is quantum mechanical, it's statistical, it's thermodynamics. It involves a lot of different areas of science, but it also involves information theory. And when you see this laid out, the last step for me putting together, this is after I became decentralized and got smarter. I said to myself, if information transfer from light happens this way, that there should be some mechanism in biology that links it to clocks and how clocks work, specifically the circadian clock.
Okay.
And guess what I found out? That's in fact true.
Okay.
So it turns out the heat that's liberated from light in circadian mechanisms happens through heat shock proteins. Heat shock proteins, specifically HIF1, controls chromatin uh, um, not recycling, but reshaping on chromosomes. So that made plausibility. And then it turned out that one of the clock genes called BMAL1 actually also is affected by HIF1, and then HIF1 actually affects, guess what? Cytochrome 1, NAD positive in the mitochondria. All of a sudden, I had the whole story.
Hmm.
Then it made sense to me why this lady showed up into my office. Now, have I ever told anybody exactly how I figured out why I didn't think she was crazy? No. This is probably the first podcast that I took you all the way through. The last part of the story was I didn't know how the physics linked to the circadian mechanism until this lady came in my office. And
Okay.
then I went to the medical school library to figure it out.
Wow. Jack, this is a very different topic, but well, not really. Do you think we should become multi-planetary species? This is a
No,
huge topic today.
no,
Why not?
because we're built to evolve on this planet. Until we can figure out how to bring light, water, and magnetism as it's optimized on Earth into a spacecraft and through the solar plasma, we shouldn't be fucking with nature.
Yeah.
We're not that smart.
Hmm. So
And the fact that Elon Musk wants to go to Mars, which is a dead red planet that has no magnetosphere, it's just such an impotent idea.
hmm.
Um, but I understand why engineers want to do things that are impossible. The problem is he's going to get people hurt doing it, just like NASA got many astronauts killed on their way to the moon.
Hmm.
You have to decide: is it worth the squeeze of the grape? I think Elon Musk has already decided that it is. But I look at this very similar to how I look at the vaccine story. Shouldn't this be put up to a planetary vote? Why should we be wasting tax dollars
Okay.
on stuff like this? Shouldn't there be informed consent? Because it may turn out that Uncle Jack's wrong, that most of the young people like you hang out with actually want to do this, and this is your future.
Hmm.
If you want to blow money on this and not buy Bitcoin, so that you can have a pretty decent life on this planet, the spaceship you're evolved to,
Mm-hmm.
then, I think then it's fair game. I just don't think there's proper informed consent that's ongoing.
Jack, what brings you most joy in life?
Doing what I'm doing right now.
Spreading consciousness.
You could call it that. I think it's more telling you about the data that I've uncovered,
Mm-hmm.
making sense of that data, telling you how I understand it, how I perceive it, explaining to you that there is no axiomatic truths. The truth is approximations of the best data we have today. And teaching silly talking humans how to think using that data. That's probably the thing that brings me the most joy.
I love that. And, I'm 17 and I'm going through this journey myself. What would you give? What advice would you give to your 17-year-old self?
Pay attention to your gut and not to your parents.
I love
Uh,
it.
I should have gone to play professional baseball and I didn't because of my mother. Instead, I wound up doing this. And I have to tell you, it would have been a really interesting journey to do it the other way.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people disagree with me when I say this, but I feel like that's something I should have done. I like doing what I'm doing now. Don't get me wrong, because I do enjoy it,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't enjoy the last 20 years of having to fight with centralized people like the government, um, organized medicine, medical boards, hospitals,
Mm-hmm.
medical staff bylaws, other physicians. I have to tell you that one of the things that's tough about being a pioneer is it's not so much the arrows that get shot in your back. It's just that you have to realize that you have to deal with a lot of ignorant people.
Mm-hmm.
And, that axiom that you always see on the internet that, what the problem with smart motherfuckers are? They have to listen to dumb motherfuckers. And it gets really frustrating,
Yeah.
especially in social media or when you do podcasts or, it happened just this week to me on Instagram where I posted something controversial that was related to a philosopher named Nietzsche about compassion. And I wound up deleting 112 people from my feed because I always put one post up a month
Mm-hmm.
that's designed to be provocative
Mm-hmm.
because I want to see what people think about it. And the way in which they think about it tells me if they're centralized or decentralized. And I have a fundamental belief that if we are going to change the world, we need the right people to do it. The right people are the decentralized people, the people that understand nature, not the people that are like the guy that I told you that none of his friends died. So, therefore, hitherto, the vaccine's fine, and we can go back to our regularly scheduled gladiator games on Netflix,
Yeah.
and swipe left on Tinder. I just those people infuriate me, but ultimately the thing that makes me happy is what Max Planck said. Science gets better one funeral at a time, and when people are dumbasses, they get taken out by their dumb ideas. That's actually the lesson I learned in decentralization. And that's a hard lesson for a surgeon to learn because we try to save everybody. I realize now that not everybody's savable. And not only that, there's some bridges that need to be burned
Mm.
and we should never go down them.
Mm. That's lovely, Jack. I really appreciate you sharing in your time. Thank you for making this happen.
No problem.